Olá, eu sou Gisele, pesquisadora da Cátedra William Butler Yeats, da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da Universidade de São Paulo, que é quem promove este Poesia ao Meio-Dia, e hoje temos a honra da presença do Andrew Fitzsimons, que nasceu na Irlanda, é professor na Gakushūin University, Tóquio, de onde fala conosco, inclusive, e ele, além de escrever sobre poesia irlandesa, publicou a respeito de Samuel Beckett, William Shakespeare e poesia contemporânea britânica. É autor de What the Sky Arranges, 2013, A Fire in the Head, 2014, The Sunken Keep, a version of Il Porto Sepolto, by Giuseppe Ungaretti, e a sua poesia também tem vindo a ser publicada em antologias e periódicos na Irlanda, no Reino Unido, na Itália, Estados Unidos, Canadá e, claro, no Japão. Concorreu ao prêmio Patrick Kavanagh em 2006, foi finalista no prêmio Montreal em 2013, e editou Thomas Kinsella Prose Occasions, de 1951 a 2006, pela Carcanet Press, em 2009, e o seu estudo sobre Thomas Kinsella, The Sea of Disappointment, saiu em 2008. Então, Andrew, thank you very much for being with us in spite of your busy schedule and our time difference.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for that nice introduction.
Thank you. We are all very curious about your foray into Japanese and Oriental culture. So if you don't mind telling us a bit about it and how did you start and how foreign is it for you nowadays as compared to when you started it? When you first started reading about Japanese culture and Oriental culture and living it.
Yeah. I suppose my first encounter with Japan was through film, and a strange film. James Bond was my first encounter with Japan. A film called You Only Live Twice, which I saw when I was a child, and it always stuck with me, And it was only many years later that I discovered that You Only Live Twice is a mock version of a basho poem. In Fleming invented a basho poem. And that's it. That's where the title comes from. So it says after basho in the introduction to the book You Only Live Twice. So that was my first encounter with it. And then during childhood, occasionally you'd see things on television or in films. I mean, I'm the generation that grew up with Bruce Lee. That was our idea. China, Hong Kong, the East. But then more seriously, I encountered Japanese people when I was a teacher of English in Dublin. So I got to know some Japanese people. I had developed an interest in serious Japanese film, Kurosawa, Ozu, those things when I was a member of the film club in university, discovering those great directors of the late 1950s, 60s, Mizoguchi, Kenji, people like that. So I had that really developed my interest in Japan. But again, it was kind of abstract in a sense, So as I said, I met Japanese people then. While I was doing my PhD in Trinity, the opportunity came to Japan, arose. And I moved here, and I've been here ever since. That was 1998. I've been here 26 years since. I had no plans to stay here that long. It just happened. It just happened. I mean, the question of foreignness. I mean, it's a difficult question. I don't particularly enjoy the word foreign. It seems kind of alienating, But it's home. At this stage, it's home. My family's here. My son is next door here. My daughter, my wife's here. It's a place that I work in, of course. I have friends. I have routine, So, I mean, my routine is not foreign to me. I get up and do the same things every day. I go to work, meet my colleagues. So in many ways, it's the usual banal kind of existence. At another level, it's continually new. I'm continually discovering new things about the place. New writers, new poems, new films, of course, but also just elements of the culture that I wasn't aware of before. So it's always an encounter. But I wouldn't call it foreign. I don't feel alienated here at all. I feel quite quite comfortable, quite at home here.
Good. That's excellent. And I found I think I didn't mention the fact you are part of a few anthologies, being one of them the wonderful Our Shared Japan, which reproduces what we also find in in some of your other books, like the poem Worlds, which if you don't mind giving us the honor of your voice, please, to that poem.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll just introduce that Our Shared Japan was a celebration of diplomatic relations between Japan and Ireland, edited by Joseph Woods and Irene De Angelis, and I had started working on versions of a book called the Zurezuregusa in Japanese, Essays in Idleness, it's sometimes translated, by the monk Kenko Yoshida, a 14th century prose miscellany, and that really was the first time I attempted to do anything with Japanese writing, and I did it by accident, really, and so it's not really a translation, it's kind of versions inspired by the Kenko book. And I did it from English versions by Donald Keane rather than from the Japanese text originally. So it's very free. And in fact, once when I went looking to find the sources of these little pieces, sometimes I couldn't find them, that they were so different. And Worlds is one that it's a much longer piece in Kenko, but I kind of reduced it to these 3 lines that you might have difficulty finding in the original. So here it is. So Worlds. Travel. Wherever you go, the world you bring with you is washed by the world you see.
Mundos, viaje. Onde quer que você vá, o mundo que você trouxer será derrotado pelo que você vir. Considering not only your amazing work as a translator, but also and mainly as a poet, taking into account the poetic forms as we read in What the Sky Arranges, how would you view this transculturality as a poet? Because we have Irish poets writing haiku, and in Brazil we have the name haikai, which considers the difference in form between the original haiku, which takes into account the stations, the seasons of the year, and the sound, the 5-7-5. How do you view that in your writing? Because you also write in short form, so
yeah. I mean, I don't have a hard and fast rule or a hard and fast definition or a hard and fast practice when I'm doing it. With Kenko, as I said, that was very free, and it was just a vehicle for me to do my own thing, really. So Kenko is prose, as I said, but I have changed them into poems, and sometimes rhyming poems, and bringing in different things, But with someone like Basho, I was very strict. I translated directly from the original Japanese. I was very strict about season words. I was very strict about syllable count. Very concerned with getting across as faithfully as I could what was going on in the Basho original, including things like puns, word games. So it was quite a different thing. At the moment, I'm trying to translate Busan. And again, I'm being quite strict as well, I'm working on a second edition of Kenko. The publisher wants to do an expanded version of it. And with that, I'll go back to being free and easy and using it as a voice for myself, really, So it depends on the thing itself, And this word transculturality is very grand. It'd be a bit too grand for what I'm thinking when I'm actually doing it. It's a much more natural process. It's much more eye on the object. Look, as Auden says, you're really concerned with this object and trying to get it right. And the kind of larger definitions would come later, and probably not for me to say,
Brilliant. I think you're giving us some hint already on one of my questions to you, which has to do with the being a 21st century poet, Irish poet in Japan. But before we get there, I'd like to say that as we go over a fire in the head, let's just before that, why can I ask you to read The Rising Tide, please?
Sure. This one, again, I used Kenko poems really to vent certain crankiness. Kenko is a very cranky writer at times, he gets angry over the smallest thing, so it kind of reminded me of myself a little bit, and he gets annoyed by certain politics, etc. So this was in my early years in Japan, and it was during the time of what was called the Celtic Tiger. And if you remember, that was the time when Ireland was becoming rich, really, for the first real time. In 1958, there had been economic expansion, the program for economic expansion in the Sean Lemass government, and the director of that was a man called T.R. Whitaker, and he has a connection with me through Thomas Kinsella. Thomas Kinsella was his secretary. Famously, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, Sean Lemass at the time, when he was trying to promote this economic transformation expansion, he said, "A rising tide raises all boats." A rising tide raises all boats. In other words, everybody would benefit from this economic expansion. So cut to 2000, 2001, 2002, the same thing happening in Ireland again. And Kenko writes about the fragility and transience of things, So this is what I did with those ideas: the Sean Lemass 1958 idea, the Celtic Tiger, and then Kenko's vision of impermanence. Okay, so the risen tide. Impermanent is the risen tide. Yesterday's pools, tomorrow's puddles. Exeunt omnes, tempus fugit. What does day teach the day? The peach and damson trees in the garden will not say.
Thank you. A maré ascendente. A maré que ascende é impermanente. As poças de ontem, as poças de amanhã, todos partem, o tempo foge. O que o dia ensina ao dia? Os pessegueiros e as ameixeiras no jardim não dirão.
Wonderful. I must say I'm very moved to hear it in Portuguese.
Thank you. And the word impermanent is really definitely very important for anyone studying Japanese culture, isn't it? I mean, I think, and the contemporary world.
Yes. Yeah.
So I thank you very much for the background on the poem, which I didn't know. So thank you. And I think also I'd like to hear you a bit more on the conjunction between Irish poet writing and doing it about and from Japan. I think that the transcultural movement changes the hue of poetry, especially the second half of the 20th century and nowadays. What would you say about it, if you can?
Just relating it, and just if we continue with the idea of the Kenko as a vehicle for thoughts about Ireland, let's say, I think the distance helps, and the kind of angle helps. You always need an imagined angle to reality. You need to take it. You can't go directly at, for example, a political event or a political instance or a politician's words. You have to take them at an angle. And I think in that case, and in using Kenko, it was actually helpful to be playful for a start, to be cranky in a way that I wouldn't allow myself in my own voice, to be angry in a way that I wouldn't allow myself in my own voice, perhaps, but using 14th century Japanese monk to complain about Irish politicians, was very liberating.
Brilliant. That's excellent. And then I selected the series of season poems, but I think we could start with The Autumn Night, if I can ask you to read that for us, please.
Well, this one, I mean, this one isn't political in that big piece sense, but you know, one of the unfortunate things about being far away is the death of family and friends while you're away, you know, and that's when distance becomes painful rather than useful, you know. So this one, it concerns the death of friends. So The Autumn Night. I passed the long autumn nights tearing up old notes and letters, putting the afterlife in order, word by word, self upon dishevelled self remembered. And then I light upon a dead friend's thoughts, and somewhere a high door opens, and I am silent, stared at by night, by dawn.
Thank you. A noite de outono. Eu passo as longas noites de outono rasgando velhas notas e cartas, colocando a vida após a morte em ordem, palavra por palavra, o próprio eu desalinhado em lembrança. Daí deparo-me, rememorando um amigo morto, e em algum lugar um portal se abre e permaneço silente, observado pela noite, pela alvorada. This is really beautiful. As all of your poems, thank you, Andrew. When we think of interarts, you are the poet of the relations between sound, image, imagination. Your translation of Ungaretti's gained Sergio Calatroni's drawings. And I'd like to know, in your viewpoint, how do images such as drawings interfere in our contemporary readings? And how, I mean, when we went, it just now occurred to me that when you went back to even Bachot's documents, I mean, how have all the materiality of what you found interfered in your readings and rereadings and rewriting translations of the materials you found? Two questions in one, but
yeah, just maybe to think about Sergio. I've done 3 books with Sergio. Sergio is an Italian artist from Pavia in Italy, and he used to teach at the Brera Institute in Milan, and then he retired, and he now lives in Japan full time. So he illustrated What Sky Ranges, he illustrated Fire in the Head, and then he did The Sunken Keep. I think particularly the drawings in Sunken Keep. Actually, you can see them behind me. There's a few of them. There's some of the ones from the different books. And with the Sunken Keep, I mean, I didn't tell him anything. It's his work. He reads them and then he goes off and does them. He does it himself. But with the Sunken Keep, of course, he was reading the original Italian because he's Italian. So he was inspired by Ungaretti directly. And that's what makes the drawings, I think, quite remarkable, really wonderful. So, and I had my translations done already, you know. So it was fascinating to see, for me anyway, to see him inspired by the Italian himself, and then seeing how my translation interacted with his drawings, you know. But it was all, it was, we were both equally free to do whatever we wanted. And if it worked, it worked. If it didn't, it didn't. So that was the way we worked, you know. And we had an exhibition of the Sunken Keep drawings in the Italian Institute here with the full set. There's not the full set in the book itself, but we had the full set, and it was really marvelous to see. You know, it worked really fantastically. You know, the second question about the Basho text, how it informed me. I mean, you know, the more I found out, the less I knew, so to speak, you know, that I realized how ignorant I was of things, you know, but you can't let it stop you trying to get as close as you possibly can with the materials available to you, you know. So that's I mean, there are some things in the Basho book that I'd probably change now, you know, but that's always going to be the case. It's always going to be the case. You can never know enough, you know.
Brilliant. I am fascinated by. I don't know if it's possible for the
Oh, it's not.
camera to.
I can.
Oh, thank you. Lovely. Yeah, this book is really amazing work, exemplar, and maybe you want to tell us a bit about its making or its origin, and the process of doing it, if you can.
Yeah. I began in 2017. No, I translated some of them before Irene de Angelis had asked me to do some translations for her book. So I did a few over the years here and there, you know. And then I think it was in 27. It was 2017, or maybe late 2016, when I went to a reading by an English poet, and in it he was talking about a translation of Basho he had done of a particular poem, you know, and he talked about the particular issue in this poem, but about the problem of plurals in Japanese. There's no plurals in Japanese, strictly speaking, you know, so that in this particular poem it can either be one cicada or many cicadas, you know. And I was thinking as he was speaking, well, it's possible to write an English version where that's ambiguous too, you know, that is ambiguous whether it's plural or singular in English too. So that poem was the famous poem about the cicada, the sound of the cicada penetrating the rocks. You know, Shizukasa ya iwa ni shimiiru semi no koe is the Japanese, and I translate it as hear the quietness entering into the rocks, cicada refrain, which I hope kind of captures the ambiguity of plural or singular, you know. So that was the initial impetus to try and solve problems, try and solve the problems of the original poems, you know. Now, of course, I had to give up the idea that I could do it all the time, but it gave me the impetus to try to discover what Basho was doing in his originals and discover more about him. And my suspicion had always been that he was a poet, not a philosopher, not a Zen monk. And my suspicions, I think, came true, that he's not a Zen monk, he's not a Zen philosopher, he's a poet, interested in what all poets are interested in, language, you know, writing into language, you know. And just on that subject of the problem of plural and singular, and the openness of poetry, the openness of Basho's poems, there's a famous instance of the famous poem where he describes the crow pausing on the branch, you know, on the dry branch. There are two paintings of that poem. In one of the paintings, there's one crow, and Basho has signed it, you know. And in another painting, there are many crows, and Basho has signed that too. So he makes no, you know, the ambiguity is embedded in the poem, you know, that he's open to both interpretations, you know. And in the Japanese language, you can manage to do that, you know.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you so much. I mean, in Brazil, we have more than 10 different translations to that poem, and some of them are really transcreations. Yeah, they become other poems, completely other poems. Yeah. But I was I'm still very amazed with this book. And there's one translation, and I didn't dare, I can never dare to translate them yet, because they would be indirect translations. So it would be like translating your own poems. Yet you're saying you were very loyal to the original. So I don't want to do that yet. But I would like to point out to people watching us, the one on page 98, which is number 255, haiku, or new form from Tanka, stopping a while in the mountains of Kai, because that made me go back to, I think, Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. I don't know how much Frost read Basho, but anyway, it's also a fascinating book, because you are explaining, you are not only transliterating the sound that people would say as they read it in Japanese, but also the explanation of the scene, the context of the poem, and that's wonderful. I've never seen such edition. And we have some publications we have 3 publications of Japan in Portuguese in Brazil, but none of them bring such context and such beautiful recreation, which is so loyal to the original. So I don't know if you want to give us the honor of reading this small one.
Sure. Stopping a while in the mountains of Kai. The journeying horse, taking comfort in barley, a traveler's rest.
Okay, and being a translator, now I'm very curious about your choice of Giuseppe Ungaretti. And how does this time difference between Ungaretti and Fitzsimons as a poet, how does it matter to you and to readers? Can you tell us a bit about it, please?
Yeah, Ungaretti. Well, Ungaretti was the first Italian poet I attempted to translate. I lived in Italy from 1989 to 1991. As a way of teaching myself Italian, I started translating Ungaretti. So it seemed simple at the time, at the beginning, because the poems are so short. So it seemed it might be easy, but I was so wrong. And now and again over the years, I translate some things. And then I'd always had this book, Il Porto Sepolto. I really loved the edition that I had, this special edition of the poem from 1990 by Carlo Ossola. I really love that book, and it's full of notes and full of information. So I decided to dive in because we were coming up to the anniversary of World War I. So 2016, and these poems were written in the trenches, in the Carso in northeastern Italy, and it's one of the most significant books in the history of Italian poetry, particularly 20th century poetry, of course, but in the history of Italian poetry. So I wanted to just have a go at it, see if I could do it, And I did it. It's extremely dense, complex poetry, and I took a few perhaps risks, even with something like the title. It's called, I called it the Sunken Keep. In the Italian, it's Il Porto Sepolto, which must be probably the same in Portuguese, is it? So you call it the buried harbor or something like that, But I decided to use sunken because in English, the story behind the image is Ungaretti was from Egypt. I know he lived for many, many years in Brazil, but he was actually born in Egypt, in Alexandria, and lived there for most of his life. He only went to Italy when he joined the army in World War I. He had heard this story of a sunken city off Alexandria. And in English, we don't talk about buried cities at sea. We talk about sunken cities, So I always thought the translation of buried, not quite fitting, And then there's a military background to the work. Obviously, he's in the army, he's in the trenches. And then the idea of keep, the military, it's a military word, the keep of castle. But also part of the theme of the poetry is the secrets you keep, and poetry as a kind of mystery, a privacy, that contains a privacy that you keep to yourself, So all of those elements I enjoyed, And one of the things about Ungaretti's poetry and Basho's poetry is it stretches my English. It teaches me English because I have to find solutions to these problems. So for me, the translation is a way of making my English grow, improving my English.
Fascinating, wonderful. It's really a word game all the time, isn't it? Thank you.
And also discovering. So, for example, in the Basho book, as I said, I followed strictly the syllable count. So Basho, at one point, he uses, or 2 points, he uses the word shirami. Shirami means lice. Okay, bed lice. Okay, and in one poem I used lice because it could fit in the pattern. But in this other poem, I needed 2 syllables. So I had to dig into my memory. And I remembered a word from my childhood in Ireland, okay, that we called lice hoppers, Okay. So I think that's a really lovely word, you know. So it was a process of discovering words from my childhood that I'd forgotten, you know, or dialect words and things like this.
Lovely. That's wonderful. I think I would suggest we really have this time limitation, but I would suggest we go to Shunkashuto, and we could do original and translation for the seasons of the year, if you don't mind.
Sure. But Shunkashuto, that title means it's a poem in celebration of the year just gone. So Shunkashuto means the four seasons: spring, you know, spring, summer, autumn, and winter. So it's four sections, and it's a sonnet. It's a hidden sonnet. Okay, this poem, in title sections. So the first one is spring. I must say also that Herbert Park is a park in Dublin. So it begins in Dublin and ends up in Japan. So spring. In Herbert Park, under a cherry tree, we improvise a spring ceremony. Cream crackers for rice snacks. For sake, Irish whiskey.
Primavera. Pelo Parque Herbert, sob uma cerejeira, improvisamos uma cerimônia da primavera. Bolachas de água e sal como petiscos de arroz. Para saquê, whisky irlandês.
Summer. We have come to Asagaya to watch the locals dance Bon Odori. When the heavens break and open, told you so, you say.
Verão. Viemos a Sagaia para ver o povo daqui dançar o Bon Odori. Quando o sol se abre e desabam, eu te disse, você quem manda.
Asagaya is a place in Tokyo. In this next one, autumn, Lake Chuzenji is a lake near Nikko in Tochigi in Japan, and it's very like Glendalough in Ireland. Autumn, Lake Chuzenji. Maple leaves dyed by a wine-red hand, finished off by us, our car.
Outono. Lago Chuzenji, folhas de bordo, tingidas num tom vermelho vinho, e por nós destruídas pelo nosso carro.
The last one, winter. I don't know whether you know about this, but every New Year there is a 12-hour historical drama on television here. So 12 hours. And strangely, the year I'm talking about, but often in years since, the background music is Irish traditional music. So it's very peculiar. So you have people, you know, from in the 17th century, Japanese people, swords, the whole business. But the background music is Irish, very, very peculiar. So this one is called, this particular year, it was about Musashi Miyamoto, the great swordsman of Japan. Winter. The New Year samurai soap this year, Miyamoto Musashi, his life and loves. The why to the sounds of Ireland.
Inverno, o sabão do samurai deste ano novo, Miyamoto Musashi, a sua vida e os seus amores. Mas por que ao som da Irlanda? Thank you very much, Andrew. It's been wonderful talking to you and acknowledging a bit more about the relations between Ireland and Japan and your own poetry and translations. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.